In my last video, I showed y'all how to draw lines, and this time I'll show you all how to render lineless. So, you have options, you know?
Artsy cha!
Hello Artlings! If you've been drawing anime for a while but would like to break out of that into semi-realism, it's totally doable, but it's a little advanced. That's because semi-realism is essentially style mixed with realistic techniques. No matter what, you should be doing some studies of realism to enter into this world of semi-realism, so be ready to start doing some photo studies. Here are a few of the most common ways artists like to add realism to their styles, by using realistic proportions, realistic shading, or realistic texture. It is up to you for what level you would like to add these to your artwork. I can't actually teach you all of these techniques in depth since they are large subjects that could have their own videos and are foundations to art anyways, but I will be showing you the process in which you can apply the semi-realism. Important tip, especially if you don't have a foundation in realistic studies or rendering, you should have a photo reference. As in, copy the lighting reference onto yourself, a 3D model, or as a hack, try doing a study of a cosplayer of your favorite anime character. I think the easiest one is just taking a picture of yourself though. The closer the reference is to yourself, such as clothes and all, the better, but at the very least, what you actually need is angle, lighting, and the pose. The point of this is to start introducing you to more advanced lighting and to have a custom reference that helps you to keep from guessing. Thankfully, my reference is pretty easy. I just stood by a window and awkwardly attempted to smirk. I won't be showing you that disaster, but I'll be showing you how I would approach a semi-realistic anime portrait. Notice that I'm using a hard airbrush from the start instead of a thin pen like a sketch pen. While you don't have to, I find that it sets me in the right mood for a more painterly render and to be less focused on clean lines but rather shading. I'm going to copy the pose and the colors from the screen capture, but I'm going to bring Shinichi's proportions to more realistic ones. For example, in real life, the head would be smaller in relation to the body and the neck would be thicker. The most notable difference is the size of the eyes are way smaller than normal anime proportions. You'll see me change his eyes drastically again later in the speed paint. The chin wouldn't be so pointy, so I added a flatter edge. The ear would align with the eye and the length of the nose, so I moved it up in relation to my new proportions. There are going to be moments like these when you would ideally employ knowledge from studying things like anatomy to fill in gaps from the simplified art style. For example, my past studies helped me to know what the nose would look like in this angle or how eyes might actually fit in this anatomy, but if you don't have the specific knowledge, that's why your reference is there to help you. And if you're struggling, use that as motivation to do realistic studies. Wonk wonk. After I got my sketch to a reasonable level, I skip the line art and go straight to rendering. You can add the flats however you would like. Make sure you follow the light source of your references and add at least one shadow to each flat color. Just like in the line art video, I find it helpful to set my sketch to a lower opacity and set it to multiply mode. No, the concept that got me into this. Lines equals contrast equals hard edges. If you think about it, your lines are here for contrast. Your line of a different shade shows that there is something here, a division. That's not a bad thing, but in general, many things don't have lines to show divisions. They only have shadows. Let's take for example the chin. Your chin doesn't actually have a line drawn onto it, separating it from your neck. But you can see the difference between the face and the chin because of the contrast through the shading. What you need to do to go lineless is to replace your lines with contrast. Contrast is shown through changes in shade or hard edges. Hard edge simply implies an unblended edge, and a soft edge means blended edges. 2 beginner methods. Method 1. Do simple cell shading. Take your line off from the 2 different shades and clean up the edge underneath. You'll see enough contrast to imply the line where your line originally was. Blend out the side that isn't representing the hard edge, and optionally you can add other shadows and tones. But not every line needs to be taken out in this painterly method, and there are shadows that are so thin that they are essentially lines. So here's method 2. Trace your line with a hard airbrush, clean up your line, and then optionally blend out one side, add other shadows and tones. Let me introduce you to a little friend, the airbrush. Usually, beginners that meet this universal art friend end up going crazy and end up overusing it or using it wrong. That's because they change all of their hard edges into soft edges. But as mentioned earlier, that means no definition. That's why it's important to use a brush that has the ability for both hard edges and blending. And that is why my favorite brush on Procreate is the medium hard brush. This is a default type of brush that you can find in any software, as long as it's not too fuzzy around the edges. The important part of this brush is that if you press down, you can make hard edges. But when you lighten your pressure, you can blend it into soft ones. So when you are shading, you can look at your reference and figure out, does this shape cast a hard or soft edge? What you'll observe is that round shapes, such as the arm or face, have a soft edge, but things that are harshly folded would have a hard edge, such as clothes. But this is still too big brain for you right now at this stage of your art, so what you need to do is to look at your reference till you are more used to shading. Now, with the help of your reference and your new friend, the airbrush, blend out one side of the shadow, usually the one that is further from the contrasting source. You can blend by using light pressure and color picking, using a softer airbrush, or using the smudge tool, which I don't prefer, but I'll cover blending in another video. Hard and soft edges are covered superbly in Sinex's video of Paint Like a Sculptor, so please check that out, it's great for any beginner. Even after you do your basic shading and blending out according to the reference, you may find that your shadows still look flat. A way to remedy this is to add a little bit more color and tone back into the shadow, since most shadows have more than one shade. Try this out by using a soft brush, color picking from outside of your shadow and lightly tapping it in. Then you color pick again and blend it together. Also, this lineless rendering is a principle. You may notice that many artists have a semi-realism art style but still use lines and line art, but most of them have a knowledge of realistic shading and may not keep a line on everything, or they employ other techniques which will be covered next. With a screen capture like this, there is a lot of details missing. That is where reference in previous studies in realism come in. For example, to up the realism of this drawing, I can add more folds to the suit. Thanks to my reference, I was able to also further understand how to shade the hand with this type of lighting. After rendering your drawing with an airbrush, you may find that the super smoothness is actually unsettling, because in real life there's texture in everything, even if you don't seem to process it. Adding texture is just the thing that will up the realism of your drawing, like the garnish on top of a simple dish to make it look extra fancy. You can think of the 3D Mario games. Although the proportions of Mario are extremely stylized, the rendering and texture of the characters and their outfits are very realistic. Here I added texture to the hands and a little bit to the hair. If I wanted to spend even more time on the hair, I could attempt to render it to a Kingdom Hearts level, but I didn't feel like quite doing that, and I haven't learned how to render hair in that way. On the other hand, one way I did add more texture is through the eyes and the suit. After realizing I didn't like the eyes proportionate to the face, I reduced it significantly and added more anatomy. I actually had to look back into Pinterest references for this part because staring at Shinichi's eyes made my brain confused. With semi-realism, it's actually good practice not just to do studies on realism, but to do studies on other artists' version of semi-realism. This way, you have the foundation, but you also learn how to stylize and simplify your realistic studies. For example, I don't have to draw every single detail of the eye, such as including eye veins, but I do notice that particular emphasis on the bottom lash line is actually quite aesthetic. The semi part of semi-realism comes from you knowing your aesthetic preferences to how much of realism you actually want to dial in. After I felt like the eyes were finally acceptable to my style, I also overlaid fabric texture for the suit to make the smoothness look less weird and cleaned up the whole thing. A little bit of texture added to the realism of the drawing, and I found I was much more satisfied with it. As you can see, you don't have to render everything realistically, or even follow your reference perfectly. In fact, I kept the proportions and shading of his suit and his hair because I wanted him to still be recognizable as Kudo Shinichi from Detective Conan. Definitely not because I was too lazy to render to a higher level of realism. But hey, that's a mission complete, and we got a semi-realistic Kudo Shinichi. In my opinion, the thing that makes the most difference in realism is actually the shading. The further you are from what you see in the photo, the more stylized it is, which is completely fine. There's nothing wrong with an extremely stylized art style, as they are iconic and beautiful in their own rights. But this tutorial is more of an intro for just in case you want to get started into semi-realism. If you really want to push the limits of semi-realism and be an artist like Wallop, what I would suggest is to watch their speed paints and become a master in shading. Realistic shading is what will really launch you into the higher levels of semi-realism, and then you can add on texture. Texture is like having a fancy ingredient that only chefs know how to use. But that's my thoughts. As always, please leave any tips and questions in the comments. Comments really make my day, and the feedback is invaluable for a small creator like me. So with much love and bubble tea to you, I'll see you in the next art venture.